Samvaad is an Ukaalo venture that looks to break down how Nepal looks at the world and what the future holds for us as Nepalis. In the first season, Nepal and the World, writer amidst will talk to experts through 6 episodes covering history, economic diplomacy, the Nepali diaspora, the Himalayas, our heritage, and our foreign policy. Here, he'll discuss the opportunities the world will present to us and the challenges we'll face.
Namaste. Welcome to Samvaad, an Ukaalo podcast where we want to break down how Nepal looks at the world and what the future holds for us as Nepalis. My name is Amish Rajmulmi and I will be your host for the podcast. Welcome to the last episode of Samvaad, an Ukaalo podcast where so far we have talked about how Nepal has looked at the world and what the future holds for us as Nepalis. Through 5 episodes covering history, economic diplomacy, the Nepali diaspora, the Himalaya, and our heritage, we have discussed the opportunities the world will present to us and the challenges we will face. In this last episode, I want to look to the future and to talk about how Nepal's foreign policy will and should evolve at a time when the global order is going through a tumultuous era. To discuss this and more, I have with me 2 international relations scholars whose works I have followed for a while and who also, I think, have the benefit of looking at Nepal from a distance. Because sometimes those of us who follow foreign policy inside Nepal can also get blindsided by this prevailing discourse that is inside the country. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Monalisa Adhikari and Niha Pandey for this last episode of Ukaalo Samvaad. Welcome, Mona and Niha.
Thank you, Amish.
Thank you so much.
Niha, I'll start with you. This Nepal's foreign policy discourse, academia, in the media, do you think it's adequate? Do you think there is a need to expand our discourse? Where do you see the fault lines? And are there any opportunities going ahead?
So when we talk about discourses, I believe that there are 2 significant discourses that has emerged in Nepal's case. The first thing is the geopolitical sensitivity discourse. And this geopolitically sensitivity of Nepal can actually be traced since the unification of Nepal as a modern state. And when we talk about geopolitics itself, we always see that geopolitics has been one of the key determining factor in Nepal's foreign policy. Also, when we talk about geopolitics, we basically have a zero-sum mentality as well. And it highly prevails in our region, our South Asian region, given our neighboring countries. So I believe that Nepal needs to adopt a position of neutrality between China and India. And it has been a major challenge for Nepal. And Nepal has to take in this task of neutralizing between India and China. Now, coming to the second discourse, I believe particularly after 2006, we see that there has been a monumental shift in Nepal's foreign policy area as well. So the focus on human rights, climate change, gender equality, human security. So we can hear these kinds of words that have started echoing around the debates of Nepal's foreign policy as well. Nonetheless, we know that geopolitics has always taken over the debates of Nepal's foreign policy.
Mona, I want to come to you. This thing that Niha mentioned about the zero-sum mentality about our foreign policy, do you agree with what Niha is saying? And do you see this happening in academia and media as well, that there is just a geopolitical focus while not talking about the other issues that Niha has mentioned?
I think yes. So for instance, I think to go back to your question about how far have we come in terms of articulating our foreign policy, one of the ways in which we can sort of assess is perhaps let's look at what are the discourses or what are the tropes that are being used. And it's pretty much, I think, 3 or 4 that come to mind. India-China competition and what does it hold for Nepal? The second trope being things around small state diplomacy and challenges for neutrality or maintaining that sense of balance. The third, I think that's lately sort of picked up, is this idea of extra-regional rivalries and, US, European Union and that side of. And I think that's sort of pretty much stayed static, I would say, because that's the thing that I studied as a student. And I don't see the discourse or articles or academic readings on it sort of changing. Now, having said that, there's a small but a good body of work around SARC, and Nepal's place in SAARC, or the South Asian region. There's also a bit of literature around Nepal's peacekeeping contribution, but I think it's really stayed as a very case study specific, and it does not contribute broadly to the scholarship on what is the state of peacekeeping, and what does Nepal have to say to that broader discourse. So yes and no, in a sense that we focus the tropes because the tropes have become tellingly familiar. I don't think we've been very imaginative in terms of articulating our foreign policy. So in that sense, it's very static and unimaginative, and I think that's perhaps a reflection of the state of Nepal. Foreign policy can only articulate and reflect the domestic discourses. So I do think that Niha is right in the sense that the geography element has sort of has held out for a very long time and continues to hold. But I do think that it has been. This shows that there have been at least 4 gaps. So first, I do think it's very unimaginative in the sense that Neha picked up on some of these. The foreign policy articulation, I don't think has been able to observe and reflect on the sea changes in Nepali society. So for instance, our patterns of migration, creation of diasporas, changing constitutional order. So I think we're one of the very few peace processes that had, that is seen as a relative success. The only other comprehensive peace agreement that came out from the mid-2000s is perhaps Colombia. So we've not been able to sort of leverage on our strengths, a relatively successful peace process, a constitutional order that ascertains or commits to ideas of inclusion, some element of civilian supremacy, some sense of justice, some sense of human rights. I don't think that reflects on it. I also think that the foreign policy does not reflect on the broader structural shift. But I think the shift is much more broader. In terms of norms, we're seeing this idea of liberal norms being the benchmark, democracy, liberal economy being the benchmark. We're moving away from almost seeing those as benchmarks. In terms of alliances, we see these this minilateralism or very thematically aligned regional groupings sort of come up. And I don't think we have sort of really come up to that in terms of articulating some of that. So for instance, Nepal always talks about peacekeeping contribution to articulate its contribution to global good. We've not had a peacekeeping mission, a new peacekeeping mission since 2014. So what does that mean for the future? If that is our contribution and there are no peacekeeping missions coming in, how do we articulate our contribution so far, but our contribution going forward? But I also think the second gap in terms of this foreign policy is also how it's sort of decentered from where the focus needs to be. So I think foreign policy needs to work for people in Nepal, right? And that's the whole idea of the state-society contract. So Nepali rule today, they're in Malaysia, they're in the Gulf, but our foreign policy is still centered on India and China. How many experts do we have that perhaps speak Arabic, perhaps understand judicial systems in the Gulf region, understand judicial systems and legal recourse mechanisms in emerging economies in Southeast Asia? And in that sense, it's also a very elitist foreign policy. It does not work for the ordinary Nepali. It works for NRN politics. That's very prevalent on where I live. The discourses around Nepalese abroad bringing in investments, I don't think they do, but that's the discourse, So it's very centered on those elites, and it's not really centered on making it work for an ordinary Nepali that the state has left behind, leaving the only recourse to migrate. And after he migrates, the state does not really articulate his needs or even sort of defend ideas of basic human rights for them.
No, Mona, you've raised quite a few things. I think one particular point that I want to go back to, what you talked about was the rise of minilaterals, the rise of, let's say, the idea of transactional international relations, right, where diplomacy is sort of seen in realist terms. Do you see this idea of non-alignment, which is seen as this Cold War relic? I mean, both of you, does it have any relevance in the 21st century then? Like, should it not be something a little bit more autonomous, thinking about strategic interests and perhaps aligning with according to where those interests lie? Niha, you want to take that?
I believe that Nepal should hold the position of non-alignment, because that would actually be one of the tools for us to be neutral among all of these rising powers in different parts of the world. And to say we have very strong foundation in our papers. But when it comes to application, when it comes to the implementation process, we can see lapses in that area. And these kinds of lapses actually arises from various internal issues as well. We have internal political issues, we have instability, we have inconsistency in our decision-making process. So when we talk about, let's say, when we're talking about human rights issues itself, we see that Nepal has been participating in the global governance of human rights to a very large extent. We've been part of Human Rights Council till 2023. And we have one of the members in the CEDAW. We have a Nepali member as well. So we have a very good status, very good position when it comes to human rights issues, when we look at it in the United Nations system. But we need to remember that there are various human rights treaties, core treaties that Nepal has signed, but there are two significant treaties that Nepal hasn't actually signed. So those two treaties are, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, there are two treaties, that is enforced disappearance and treatment of migrant workers. So these two treaties has taken a backseat when it comes to Nepal's policies as well. There is a hesitancy in signing and ratifying this covenants. And what does this actually imply? The issue of impunity can actually be seen, and that actually possesses a negative view of Nepal's participation in global governance. And to add more to it, I think we are restricting, as we discussed earlier as well, we've been restricting ourselves within the discourse of India and China, I believe. Because foreign policy, when we look at Nepal's foreign policy, we see that our foreign policy is based on the principles of United Nations Charter, on Panchashil. That is, of course, based on the principle of coexistence and non-alignment. And we have committed to international laws, norms of world peace. So I think Nepal continues to maintain its important responsibilities in various global processes, as we talked about peacekeeping as well, as I mentioned briefly about United Nations Human Rights Council as well. So I believe that all these foreign policy objectives and Nepal's membership of various international organizations actually illustrates the importance of maintaining the non-alignment position. So I believe that Nepal in 21st century should hold a non-alignment position, because there's always this insecurity between our neighboring countries. We need to start, side by side, we need to start tackling non-traditional threats, such as security threats, such as climate change, human rights, terrorism, human trafficking. And I believe that this could successfully be confronted if we have this position of non-alignment. And overall, to say, in order to balance between all of these issues, I think non-alignment being there within our foundation as well, we do require this position.
Mona, would you agree?
I don't see it as a contradiction, the fact that there is non-alignment as a broader principle and there are multiple unilateral partnerships as a part of it. I don't see it as a contradiction in itself. The very idea is that non-alignment, perhaps ideas like non-alignment were pitched at a certain time because there was difficulty in perhaps envisioning some form of alliances, but also what does the alliance bring for our own autonomy of decision making, right? So I think non-alignment allows you to have that choice of flexibly aligning on different issues as they come up. And it also allows you to navigate these complex alliances navigate or address problems that might come across with these complex alliances. So for instance, if we were to completely align ourselves with India or completely align ourselves with China, we would be inheriting a lot of legacies that comes vis-a-vis China's place in the world or India's place in the world, right? So non-alignment gives us that safer space, I think, but I don't see it as a contradiction. So I think as a broader principle, non-alignment should be upheld, but that in that sense that we need to identify that it allows us to freely and flexibly put ourselves in terms of cooperative arrangements and relationships on different themes and issues And he has talked about some things where Nepal is seen to be, or at least because of Nepal's position as a small state, is not seen as a threat. So we have a lot of leadership. We can, for instance, leverage our status as a small state, but also our contribution to global good in terms of peacekeeping, etc., our rather successful peace process. We can leverage all of that to actually lead on some themes around in global governance. Human rights could be one, climate change could be another.
So the question is also comes in where sort of Nepal can leverage its strengths in terms of foreign policy. And at least, I mean, one of the analysis that we make over Nepal is that we don't get to see a continuity in our foreign policy because of the frequent changes in government. So I just want to get a sense, perhaps, Mona, from you, that what does these frequent changes in government, how do they impact the way we conduct our diplomacy? Do you think it hampers our diplomatic capacities? But if non-alignment is the foundation, there should a certain sense of continuity always emerges in our foreign policy?
So I see that non-alignment, of course, is a principle, right? That at an operational level, we operationalize non-alignment in different ways on different themes, right? And I do think one of the things, so going back to your question about what does frequent changes in government mean, does a principled position on non-alignment give a continuity? But I think Nepal's come to that point where, I mean, even for me as a Nepali, it's hard to keep up with the pace of change, you know? So I can only imagine what it feels like for an outsider to sort of keep up with the pace of change. But I think we've reached a position where, despite what we say, our conduct, the trust on Nepal's position on certain things, it's eroding. I mean, very few members of the international community can trust Nepal on certain decisions, right? So one is because we've gone from extreme appeasement to violent anti-nationalism, and that's quite quick in how we pace it, right? So extreme appeasement in terms of how we sort of uphold one China policy, perhaps, how we sort of allow for the Indian embassy to give small grants, which now I think has gone to 20 crores overnight. I mean, who makes this decision? None of us knows, but it's really extreme appeasement to extreme violent anti India sentiment. So, but I think the other thing is also the contradicting pledges that we make. So, for instance, we talk to the United States about treating the Tibetans better. We talk to the Chinese about upholding one China policy, which the Chinese infer as policing Tibetans, perhaps, right? So these contradicting pledges and this shift between appeasement to really a countering combative narrative, I think regardless of what we say, what we do, in a sense that, and because of the frequent changes in government, it's very difficult for an international partner to trust Nepal beyond what it says.
Niha, would you agree? Does this frequent change in government result in, let's say, a lack of trust in Nepal in terms of how it's conducting a foreign policy?
One thing that we need to remember when we talk about foreign policy is, so foreign policy is basically based on the national interest of a country, right? And we've seen our national interest being enshrined in our constitution as well. So given that basis, given that foundation and its application process, I would want to come back to the implementation and application process as well. You see that this frequent changes in the government actually influences the diplomatic practices of the country as well. And that is basically due to over-politicization within the bureaucratic structure as well. So it's basically driven by, let's say, party interest rather than the national interest of the country.
Yeah, I suppose one of the issues is that these changes in government also leads to a change in the way we conduct, let's say, foreign policy through our messaging, right? Like, I mean, the message that we are giving out to the world on certain issues, awarding an investment contract, withdrawing a contract, then again, that's sort of like different stances depending on the government. I suppose all of that also leads to a lack of trust in how, let's say, Nepal presents itself on the world. But Niha, I want to come to you, and I know that your PhD, you've been researching feminist foreign policy and Nepal's experiences. What does it mean to have, like, I mean, we have the first woman foreign secretary now. What is your research telling us about feminist foreign policy inside Nepal?
So when we talk about feminist foreign policy, let me just go back to 2014 when Sweden was the first country that announced that they will be adopting a feminist foreign policy and practicing feminist foreign policy. However, they've actually rolled back given the situation of Russia, Ukraine, and the change in the government. But despite of that, if you look at the handbook of Sweden's feminist foreign policy, it's really, really influential. And it actually gives us a message on how to actually practice foreign policy inside and outside by including all the genders. So when I talk about feminist foreign policy, what it is exactly is that we're using a feminist approach to global politics as well as international relations. So when we talk about feminism in international relations, it can be traced back since the First World War itself. And there are many long-standing feminist thinkers, and there are practices as well that has been following. But giving a title, a name as feminist foreign policy actually began from 2014. So there are major themes that evolves around feminist foreign policy. So what are those themes is gender equality, we talk about inclusivity, we talk about intersectionality, we talk about empathetic cooperation, and we talk about ethics of care. So what are these terms? And how are countries who have actually adopted or pledged to adopt a feminist foreign policy working on it? So as I mentioned earlier as well, Sweden, they've talked about including people of all genders and trying to ensure they've actually used a framework called 3R plus 1R. So the 3 R's are rights, representation, resources. That's based on the reality. So that's the 4R framework that Sweden talks about. And it tries to simply mean that people of all genders have equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities. And it emphasizes on applying a systematic gender equality perspective throughout its foreign policy. We need to increase resources, we need to increase research in order to achieve that vision. So we need to ensure that there is increasing women's representation. We need to ensure that people of all gender are treated equally, they are listened to, and their issues are brought into forefront when it comes to the foreign policy practices. So that is the first thematic issue, and that's what I've been actually working on significantly.
So what is your research shown? How is it done in Nepal so far?
So basically, there are various enablers as well as barriers when it comes to the implementation process of feminist foreign policy. So I'm in a very preliminary phase right now, so I can just briefly explain to you what I've actually come across. So there are two issues that I would want to bring to the forefront. The first thing is, when we talk about enablers, right? The first thing is we need to remember about our 33% representation in the parliament. 33% women representation in the parliament, and how they can significantly bring in debates, bring in marginalized issues. Because, I talked about intersectionality, right? Women in Pahad can have a different issue related to foreign policy, whereas women in border areas can have different issues when it comes to our foreign policy. So these kinds of issues needs to start echoing around in the parliament. And I believe that the 33%, the number that we have, could actually make a significant contribution in that regards. So that is to some extent, it gives us a positive message as well. The second thing is looking at our constitutional provision. We do talk about gender equality. It's written there in the constitution. So it shouldn't just be limited within our domestic sphere. We have to try to ensure about practicing gender equality outwards as well. And of course, when we look at Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we see a significant number of women who are in the service right now. And we have our first female foreign secretary as well. And I think that is also a positive, that could actually create a positive environment. Because women in decision-making process, meaningful decision-making process, meaningful participation and decision-making process is very, very important to bring in such kind of issues in picture. And I believe we are in the right direction in that regard. So these are the indicators that we can think about. The second indicator that I want to talk a little bit about is regarding the women, peace and security agenda. So Nepal is quite advanced, and we are now in our second national action plan on 1325. Now, what exactly is this 1325? I actually, when I was conducting my interview as well, we had a lot of discussion about this Security Council Resolution 1325. So what is it is that Women, Peace and Security agenda actually promotes a gender perspective and women's equal and meaningful participation in peace processes. And there are 4 pillars within the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That is participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery. So Nepal has adopted its first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security in 2011. And it is one of the state parties to 1325, which actually clearly pledges and call for action to protect and promote security to women and children from potential risks of armed conflict. So we've actually implemented our first NAP. And we are actually in our second NAP as well, if you look at it. So I think it was last year that we've actually come up with the second National Action Plan as well. So we're doing quite good with our National Action Plan processes as well. So I think that Nepal, being an Asian country, would actually be in a good position. And we do have the indicators as well to actually adopt a feminist foreign policy. And also, Nepal, being a least developed country, we are actually aiming to upgrade ourselves to a middle-income country soon. So feminist foreign policy could actually generate external development funding to accomplish those commitments that we have made.
Mona, I want to come to you, and something that Niha also just talked about, creating these, let's say, like using feminist foreign policy as a sort of an external aid, sort of a lever. And what you were talking about earlier about just swinging between extremes, right? Like in the way we sort of look at our neighbors, we sort of look at other countries, other powers. And one of the most curious aspects of Nepali foreign policy, at least the history part of it that I've noticed, is that we have somehow in our foundational non-alignment policy has just allowed us to work in foreign aid, receive foreign aid as a recipient country from pretty much everyone. I think during the Cold War, we received it from the USSR, from US, from China, from India. Name the country and there was an aid giver and we've received aid from them. So does this long history of 70 years of aid, do you think it creates an aid dependence that affects the way we look at donor countries, that sort of looks at, the way the donor countries have influence on our development policies, our aspirations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that 70 years of aid means, as you said, means that there is an industry that's built around it, right? So as political scientists, people talk about path dependencies. So there's an industry that's built around aid. There is a particular elite group that sort of is sustained by aid, etc. So I do think that, yes, you also had this thing about aid versus investment type thing, right? So I think because of the history of aid, it's almost like we've been drugged to sort of only talk about aid when we talk about foreign policy. So there were a lot of these, at some point during my PhD, I was looking at political party manifestos, and some of them talked about the ability to bring aid. You would have thought that was, so I work on Myanmar. When Myanmar in late 1988, it was 1988 or 87, it was degraded to a least developed country. The military was so embarrassed that it didn't announce it for a long, long time. And here we have it, the population, we want to be an LDC. And of course, there's a lot of benefits that come through being an LDC, etc., a lot of aid. But I think we've reached a point where there is almost no way out. They're in, like, from NGOs to our thinking about, even us, I think we've been affected psychologically, that in a sense that we think that aid is the only way out. And there's this idea of aid versus investments, right? And I think that's also one of the things that you had when you sent us the list of things that you wanted to discuss. So I do think that there is a complementarity between aid and investments. So now, I think it was a few months back that I'd read a paper about a small but a positive correlation between foreign aid leading to foreign investments, right? And so there is a complementarity. The net effect of one on the other might be small, but it is likely to be positive, especially if the aid is centered around sectors like roads and infrastructure. It allows the private sector not to have to spend on these capital-heavy industries and then swiftly look into manufacturing or services, etc., right? But if that also means that we need to map our areas of aid, where is it that we want aid so that we're able to catalyze investments? And I think that's the homework we don't quite do. And because there's a 70 years of history of aid and we're psychologically dependent on it, it also works both ways, right? We're happy with any aid that's provided, as long as there's something to stop, aid from totally sort of disappearing. So I don't see a reason I don't see Nepal sort of moving away from aid to investments by itself. So because now there is a group that sort of relies on aid, right? There's the popular middle class that will work in NGO, etc. But I do see that it's changing in the West. So not from a demand perspective, but from a supply perspective, because of the nature of governments that we have in the West, leaning more on the right wing, more in terms of why should we be giving out aid. We'd focus on aid that only catalyzes investment. So I do think from a supply side perspective, there will be a shift. But until that comes, I don't see Nepal sort of moving completely away.
We've gone through a lot of the harder questions. I want to just go in with a sort of a more on a lighter note and think about this idea of soft diplomacy, right? And what do you think? Like, I mean, both of you opening it up just as a sort of concluding, you guys live outside, looking at Nepal from outside. Where do you think our strengths lie in terms of soft diplomacy, and where are our weaknesses?
Particularly post 1990, I would put it. The functioning of our foreign policy as well as diplomacy has become more and more democratized, and it has become insignificant to the key state actors. Ministry of Foreign Affairs has actually taken a backseat, to say. Like, the government does not prioritize Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If internally, if we are strong enough to actually give out the message, to train our diplomats, to have an effective diplomatic practices based on all of these areas, then of course, I think we can leverage our strength accordingly. So as I mentioned earlier as well, over-politicization has been one of the major weaknesses in this part. Secondly, politicization of the institution itself. When you look at the appointments of the ambassador, I find it very interesting to see. See, there's always this debate of career appointee versus political appointee, to say. And the way the political appointee actually takes place is very controversial. So this also puts a lot of it puts a lot of negative impact in our diplomatic practices, and this, of course, impacts our soft power diplomacy, to say. And then comes our intellectual capacity. We can see our intellectual capacity in a very minimum level. And why is that so is because of the research as well. We see research not being conducted to the extent that is actually required. And we do not have institutional memory as well. It's zero. So we can actually see that these factors actually play around when we talk about why we are in a backseat, why it's holding a negative impact when it comes to our soft power diplomatic practices. Now, how do we better leverage this strength? Of course, we need skilled diplomats. Effective diplomacy is very, very important. And making the people within the ministry aware about the significance of public diplomacy, trying to ensure that the right person is in the right place, to say, because we talked briefly about having diplomats in different parts of the world based on the language as well. So these kinds of factors needs to be taken into consideration, I believe. And of course, resources, like all the resources, particularly financial resources. And I think everyone is pretty well aware about the situation of embassies in different parts of the world. And I believe even Mona might have experienced some hiccups in that part. You will have experienced it. So these are a few issues that we could actually think about.
At the risk of sounding like a cynic in the room, I feel I do see a point of soft diplomacy, and in some areas I do think we can leverage it, but I do think it's limited in a sense that, so for instance, I work on comparative peace processes, and I'll say this, that every week, every year, there's something called the Geneva Peace Week or the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development or the Oslo Forum. I don't see a reason why Lumbini can't hold the next World Peace Forum, We've had Buddha was born in Nepal. We've had a largely successful peace process compared to the likes of the recent ones. As Nepalis, we might be cynical about what we've achieved, but I think looking from the point of Syria, Yemen, Sudans that have come up after us, I think we've been relatively successful. So I do see that we can leverage on some of our strengths. But also, I think the legacy of peace is especially something that we can leverage on. But I also feel sort of cynical about this because I feel for decades we've only relied on soft diplomacy. How long can we do Mount Everest is in Nepal or Buddha was born in Nepal? So I think the utility almost is getting to a point where it's exhausted. So how do you sort of leverage and how do we sort of deal with this and sort of bring it back in? I do think that there's some amount of thinking in terms of tying up the different parts of the threads. So, for instance, tourism, the Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Infrastructure. There are infrastructure deficits in some of the parts like Dolpa, which is magnificently beautiful. But how many tourists know of it? That also means that this lack of joint of approach also means that there's a lot of pressure around places like Pokhara, which is not sustainable in the long run. So, but also this larger kind of what are the type of tourists that we're trying to get to Nepal? Is something that we need to think about. The Bhutan model versus the Nepal model people talk about, and I think, so I do think that it needs to be sort of the soft diplomacy needs to be backed by more hard infrastructure financing, more thinking in terms of how to ensure safety, or more sanitized hotels or good public transport, regulated places to stay. All of that needs to come together rather than just relying on Buddha was born in Nepal. But much as I'm proud of my history, I think we've come to a point of exhaustion.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Niha. I think both of you have raised some very, very interesting points. Of course, Nepali foreign policy has to evolve. There has to be more learning. We have to devote more resources. And with that, this first season of Ukaalo Samvaad comes to an end. We hope you've enjoyed listening to us. We look forward to your comments. Do write to us. Have a great day. Goodbye.
If you have any feedback and suggestions, write to us at ukalosamvaad@gmail.com. ukalosambaad@gmail.com. This podcast was recorded at the Ukaalo studio. The show's production and creative team includes Kritik Sreshta, Kiran Dal, Richa Thapa, and Amod Pyakurel. Original music by Dr. Dhruvesh Chandra Regmi. Samvaad is an Ukaalo presentation.